Imagine locking yourself inside a literal steel oven, right? Strapping it to your chest, and then trying to hike through this dense, sweltering Mexican jungle while highly trained warriors are hurling obsidian-bladed clubs right at your head.
Yeah, that sounds like a total nightmare.
It really does. But I mean, that is essentially what Hollywood wants you to believe the Spanish conquistadors did. So, and a massive welcome to you on behalf of the YouTube channel Voces de la Historia and our specific series, La Conquista.
It's great to be here for this one.
Yeah, today we are taking a deep dive into the historical records to basically completely dismantle the cinematic myth of the 16th century Spanish combatant in Mexico. Because you know the image, right?
Oh, absolutely. The massive state-sponsored royal army.
Exactly. Nobilites clad head to toe in gleaming steel, marching in perfect formation. But when you look at the actual transcripts, the ledgers, the actual material reality of these expeditions, that image just shatters entirely.
It really does. It falls apart the second you look at the primary sources.
Right, so our mission today is to get straight into the engine room of the conquest. We're looking at who these people actually were, what they genuinely wore, and how they had to, completely adapt to their martial arts just to survive.
Okay,
let's unpack this, because the reality of this fighting force is far more gritty, complex, and honestly, a lot more fascinating than the legend of a knight in shining armor.
It absolutely is. I mean, the contrast between the cultural myth and the historical reality on the ground is just staggering.
It's like two different worlds.
Yeah, and we often fall into this trap of looking back at the 16th century through the lens of modern nation states, you know? We assume that an event as massive as the fall of the Aztec Empire was executed by this formal national military machine deployed by a king.
Right, like an official army deployment.
Exactly. But if we want to truly understand the mental profile, the tactics, and really just the sheer desperation of these men in Mesoamerica, we first need to completely redefine the structure of the force. You have to take that idea of a royal, state-sponsored Spanish army and just throw it out the window.
So wait, if King Charles V isn't opening up the royal treasury, outfitting a grand army, and issuing marching orders across the Atlantic, what exactly is the structural reality we're actually looking at here?
We are looking at private enterprises.
Like businesses?
Yes, exactly like businesses. These expeditions were fundamentally high-risk, privately funded ventures. They were bankrolled by these complex networks of family, friends, local merchants in the Caribbean, and just basically opportunistic investors.
So it's less like a traditional military deployment and much more like a modern tech startup looking for angel investors. You know, you pitch an idea, you pool your capital, you take on a massive amount of personal debt, and you just hope for a huge payout at the end before your burn rate destroys you.
That is the perfect analogy. And just like a startup, if you run out of capital, which in this context meant food, weapons, or indigenous allies, your enterprise just dies in the jungle.
Wow.
Yeah. The captains of these expeditions were essentially the CEOs and the primary investors. I mean, Hernán Cortés is the ultimate example here.
Because he didn't get a blank check from the crown, right?
Not at all. To fund the expedition to Mexico, he mortgaged himself to the hilt. He put up his personal fortune, his lands, and crucially, the indigenous labor he held in encomienda in Cuba.
Let's actually pause on that term for a second, encomienda, because that's not just some sterile line item on a ledger. That was a brutal system of forced labor and tribute imposed on the native population of the Caribbean, right?
Yes, a horrifyingly brutal system.
And he's basically leveraging the wealth extracted from that exploitation to secure loans for his next venture.
Precisely. It was this vicious cycle of frontier economics. Cortés essentially bet his entire life, the lives of his men, and his profound financial debt on a single, incredibly dangerous roll of the dice.
Talk about high stakes.
Right. If the expedition failed, he wasn't just militarily defeated. He was completely, utterly ruined financially. And that intense financial pressure really defined the psychological profile of the combatants.
Because they had everything to lose.
Exactly. They were terrified of dying in battle, sure, but they were equally terrified of returning to Cuba and being thrown into debtor's prison.
Which, honestly, explains the bizarre leadership structure I saw in the sources we looked at. Wait, are you telling me a guy could become a military captain with zero combat experience just because he bought a boat or a ton of cassava bread?
I am telling you exactly that. Yes, the financial barrier to entry was the primary metric of your status.
That is insane.
It is. I mean, Cortés had some combat experience in the Antilles, but he certainly hadn't fought in the major European conflicts like the Italian Wars. if you brought horses, which, by the way, were astronomically expensive, you were just given a command position.
Just for having a horse.
Just for the horse.
Yeah.
And cassava bread was the foundational food supply for the whole venture. So if you supplied the bread, you had massive leverage.
But throwing a bunch of heavily armed, financially stressed, inexperienced investors into a hostile jungle sounds like a recipe for immediate mutiny. I mean, if there's no royal general enforcing martial law, how on earth did they manage the internal supply and debt without immediately turning on each other when things got tough?
That is the big question. And they managed it through incredibly strict, methodical social contracts called ordinances.
Okay, what were those?
Well, before they even set sail, the group would draft and sign this very specific code of conduct. It regulated everything from camp discipline to prohibiting gambling and blasphemy.
Like an HR handbook for conquistadors.
Basically, yeah. But the genius of the ordinances was how they codified the payout. First, they legally secured the quinton real, the royal fifth.
Right, the cut for the king.
Exactly. They reserved 20% of all acquired wealth for the crown to ensure the whole enterprise remained legally legitimate in the eyes of Spain.
Which is a pretty smart insurance policy, so they aren't just declared rogue pirates by the king. And what about the remaining 80%?
It was divided strictly based on your initial investment. It was a fiercely meritocratic capitalist structure wrapped up in a military expedition.
So if you put in more, you got more out.
Yeah. If you fought as a basic foot soldier, you got 1 share. If you brought a horse or specialized weapons like a crossbow or an early firearm, you received double or even triple shares.
Oh.
The prospect of that mathematically guaranteed payout is really what kept the investors cohesive when they were, starving in the swamps.
And the demographics of these so-called investors absolutely shatters the monolithic image of the Castilian conqueror. I mean, the historical sources paint a wildly diverse ranks. We're talking about Genoese sailors, Flemish merchants, Portuguese mercenaries.
Oh, the diversity was massive.
Yeah, and one of the most striking details that Hollywood completely ignores, there were conquistadors of African descent fighting in these ranks.
The historical record is abundantly clear on this, yeah. The presence of non-Castilians was significant everywhere, but the story of Juan Garrido completely redefines our understanding of the social mobility within these frontier armies.
His trajectory is astonishing. We're talking about a man born in West Africa who was enslaved and brought to Europe. He eventually becomes a free man living in Portugal and Seville.
Right.
And as a free man, he crossed the Atlantic, joins these expeditions, fights in the conquest of Puerto Rico and Cuba, and ultimately lands in Mexico alongside Cortés, fighting as an armed, free participant in the siege of Tenochtitlan.
It's a phenomenal life story, and it highlights the chaotic pragmatism of the frontier. I mean, in the deeply entrenched social hierarchy of Old World Europe, race and bloodline rigidly dictated your place in society.
They're locked in.
Exactly. But in a desperate startup army, thousands of miles from Madrid, capable men were valued over Old World hierarchies. Garrido possessed military skill, experience in the Caribbean campaigns, and survivability.
Right, because in the immediate heat of combat, the man standing next to you in the shield wall is judged by his competence, not his origins.
That's all that matters when your life is on the line.
Which totally flips the concept of the European nobleman, the hidalgo, on its head, too. You'd think having a noble title meant you were automatically an officer sitting in a silk tent giving orders.
You would think so.
But you had men from Navarre with noble titles who were entirely penniless, enlisting as lowly foot soldiers. The jungle didn't care about your grandfather's title, it cared if you could hold the line.
Exactly. Survival and merit dictated your status. So we have this pragmatic, highly diverse, heavily indebted private army where every penny counts and survival is literally the only metric that matters.
Yeah.
And that raw pragmatism brings us to one of the most dramatic adaptations of the conquest, their equipment.
Right, because if these guys are paying out of pocket and sleeping in the mud, European steel isn't just too expensive, it's a tactile nightmare. We really need to dismantle the iconic image of the Morion, that classic helmet with the sweeping crest and the turned-up brims. I mean, it's on the cover of every textbook about the era.
It is, and it is completely anachronistic for the conquest of Mexico in 1519.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The Morion didn't become widely popular among European infantry until decades later, well into the 1540s and 50s.
So what were they wearing?
The men riding with Cortés were wearing much simpler headgear, typically a capacete, which was just a basic conical helmet, or a salada, which sometimes had a visor but was much closer to like a medieval infantry helm.
And as for the rest of the body, the full suit of shining steel plate armor was practically non-existent, right?
It was an absolute rarity. Again, think about the economics of the startup. Full-plate steel was astronomically expensive, bespoke equipment.
Most of these guys are broke.
Right. But even for the wealthy captains who could afford it, the environmental reality of Mesoamerica made it a death trap.
Yeah, the heat must have been unbearable.
Wearing a full harness of steel in the tropical humidity of the Yucatan or the coastal plains is agonizing. It heavily restricts your mobility, and the heat exhaustion alone would drop a soldier before an enemy ever reached him.
Wow.
So most men wore partial armor at best. Maybe a steel breastplate or a gorget to protect the neck, leaving their arms and legs completely exposed.
This triggers one of the most fascinating cultural exchanges of the entire conflict, in my opinion. They look at what the indigenous warriors are wearing, they feel that suffocating heat, and they just completely ditch the European standard.
Yes, absolutely do.
They adopt the Ichcahuipilli, the thick, quilted cotton armor worn by the Mesoamerican armies. They even threw away their European espadrilles when they literally rotted off their feet in the humidity, replacing them with indigenous sandals, the cacti.
What's fascinating here is the sheer raw calculus of survival. I mean, they didn't adopt the cotton armor to make a cultural statement. They adopted it because European steel was actively failing them.
Hold on, though. Wearing a thick cotton duvet in a tropical jungle sounds just as miserably hot as a steel plate. I mean, if they're sweating to death anyway, why on earth did they all switch to it? Why downgrade to cotton?
Well, it wasn't a downgrade at all. It was a highly specialized adaptation to local weaponry.
Okay, how so?
The primary close-quarters weapon of the indigenous armies was the macana, or macohidal. That's a dense wooden club embedded with razor-sharp obsidian blades.
Right, those things are terrifying.
They really are. A strike from a macana didn't just cut it, delivered massive, crushing blunt force trauma. Thin, cheap European steel could actually dent upon impact, trapping the soldier inside their own armor, restricting their breathing or movement.
Oh man, that's awful.
Yeah. The thick, densely packed layers of the Ichcahuipilli, however, were phenomenal at absorbing and dissipating that kinetic energy. It caught the obsidian blades and cushioned the crushing blow.
So it's essentially acting like 16th century Kevlar.
Yeah.
It catches the projectile or the blade rather than just, trying to deflect it.
Precisely. And the second reason is maintainability. Think about the logistics of this rogue army.
Right, they don't have supply chains.
Exactly. If a steel breastplate takes a massive dent, you cannot fix it in the middle of a swamp without a blacksmith, an anvil, and a forge. Once it's compromised, it's useless.
That makes sense.
But if your cotton armor gets slashed by obsidian, you can mend it in the field that night with a bone needle and some thread. That level of field maintainability was quite literally the difference between life and death.
That paints such a vivid picture of guys just doing whatever it takes to survive the next 10 minutes. But this ruthless adaptation wasn't just defensive, right? Their offensive tactics also had to morph entirely, resulting in this bizarre mix where they revived obsolete European fighting styles.
They did, yeah.
Let's look at their core offensive setup. The sword and the rodila, which is a small, highly maneuverable buckler shield.
It's a fascinating tactical regression. Because in Europe, during this exact same period, the agile swordsman was becoming completely obsolete.
Really?
Yeah. The battlefields of the Italian wars were being dominated by the birth of the tercios. These were massive, dense blocks of infantry holding pikes that were 15 feet long, supported by early firearms.
Okay.
If a man with a short sword and a tiny buckler charged a wall of European pikemen, he was instantly impaled.
So if the swordsman was totally obsolete in Italy, why was it suddenly the most devastating weapon in the Americas?
Because the context of the battlefield shifted entirely. Mesoamerican armies did not fight in rigid, tightly packed pike squares.
How did they fight?
Their warfare was deeply rooted in capturing prisoners for sacrifice, which required looser, more fluid, and much more individualized combat formations.
I see.
So when you take the Iberian swordsman, who was trained in these rapid skirmish-style martial arts, and you put him in a chaotic, fluid melee against warriors who are trying to grapple and capture rather than instantly kill, the agility and close-quarters lethality of the sword and rodella is reborn.
It was the perfect counter.
It was the perfect counter to the local style of war.
But eventually, Cortés does have to face those European tactics. When Panfilo de Narvaez is sent by the governor of Cuba with a massive, heavily armed Spanish force to arrest Cortés, Suddenly, Cortés is the one staring down a superior force of European cavalry.
A very dangerous situation for him.
Right, because to stop horses, you need a wall of long pikes. But Cortés is entirely cut off from his supply chain and has absolutely no iron left to forge pike heads.
This is one of the greatest moments of military hybridization in the entire era.
Yeah, how do they solve that?
Cortés realizes he needs European doctrine, but he lacks European materials. So he turns to his indigenous allies in the region of Chinantla. These allies possessed highly advanced local metallurgy. They used their own casting techniques to mass produce completely functional, razor-sharp copper tips for the Spanish pikes.
That is incredible.
Right. Cortés' men literally defeated a superior, state-sanctioned Spaniard army using a European tactical formation built entirely with indigenous materials and craftsmanship.
It's just a stunning realization. And it means we also need to reevaluate the technology that usually gets all the credit, right? The firearms and crossbows.
Yes, absolutely.
Because the myth is that the Spanish just mowed down thousands of indigenous warriors with overwhelming firepower. But the reality is they had very few of these weapons. The black powder was constantly ruined by the humidity, and an arquebus took an eternity to reload.
It was a very slow process.
So how were they actually deploying them to such devastating effect if it wasn't just a wall of lead?
They deployed them as tactical scalpels, not broadswords. The true value of the early firearms and crossbows in this theater wasn't mass casualties. It was psychological and structural warfare. They used them specifically to snipe the enemy leadership.
But how did they even know who the leaders were in a swirling melee of tens of thousands of combatants?
Because Mesoamerican commanders were highly visible. They wore elaborate, towering feather standards strapped to their backs to signal their position and direct their troops.
Oh, wow.
You have to remember, in the deafening noise of a 16th century battle, there are no radios.
Right, you can't hear anything.
Exactly. European armies used bugles and drums, but Mesoamerican armies relied heavily on these visual signals. By making themselves visible to their troops, the commanders inadvertently painted a giant bullseye on their own backs.
So by targeting the guy with the massive feathers, the Spanish aren't just lowering enemy morale. They are literally severing the opposing army's communication network.
Exactly. The sudden noise, the smoke, and the violent death of a prominent commander at a distance completely shattered the visual command structure.
That is brutal.
It was. Without those visual cues, the intricate maneuvers of the Mesoamerican armies just dissolved into chaos. It was a targeted decapitation of the enemy's ability to communicate.
Causing that kind of chaos is brilliant, but to survive being vastly outnumbered by the sheer mass of the indigenous armies, this tiny Spanish startup had to maintain ironclad order among themselves. I mean, they couldn't afford a single man breaking rank.
That is the crucial counterweight here. They leveraged the chaos of the enemy, but relied on the brutal discipline of the European military revolution to save themselves. The concept of close order fighting as a unified, tightly packed machine was their anchor.
Like a phalanx.
Exactly. Bernal Diaz del Castillo leaves us this incredible account of the battles in Tlaxcala. He describes the Spanish forces charging uphill against a massive opposing army.
Uphill, that sounds exhausting.
It is. But they didn't break into a run or individual sprints. They moved in perfect, rhythmic unison, stepping together, keeping their shields locked. They knew with absolute certainty that the second they lost cohesion and separated, the sheer numbers of the opposing army would swallow them whole. Cohesion was literally their only mechanism for survival.
So if the infantry's job was to act as an unbreakable anchor, the cavalry had a completely different yet equally specialized role. And again, we have to throw out the European stereotype.
Definitely.
They weren't using the heavy armored medieval charging tactics where a knight locks his lance and plows through an enemy line by sheer force of weight. They had very few horses, the terrain was incredibly broken, and they relied on an entirely different martial art of riding called la jineta.
Yes, la jineta was a style of riding inherited from centuries of frontier conflict back on the Iberian Peninsula, heavily influenced by Moorish cavalry tactics. It is entirely designed for skirmishing.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because I was trying to picture the biomechanics of how this actually worked on the battlefield. So they aren't acting like a battering ram. They are more like a swarm of hornets.
That hornet analogy perfectly captures the biomechanics of the tactic. The jineta style is defined by using very short stirrups and riding with bent knees.
Okay, so they're sort of crouched over the horse.
Exactly. The rider is essentially standing up in the stirrups, keeping a very low forward center of gravity. This gives the rider extreme agility. They can accelerate instantly, stop on a dime, and pivot the horse entirely using their body weight.
Which a heavy knight couldn't do.
Not at all. A heavily armored European knight, locked deep into a high-back saddle with long stirrups, simply couldn't maneuver like this.
So instead of a massive heavy charge into the center of a line, they were operating on the flanks.
They operated in very small, coordinated packs, just 2 to 4 riders at a time. They would execute rapid, hit-and-run maneuvers, darting into the loose formations of the enemy.
Like hornets.
Like hornets, yeah. And because they were elevated, they used their extreme mobility to strike downward at the unprotected faces of the enemy warriors with their lances, and then wheeled away instantly before the warriors could grapple the horses or drag the riders down.
That must have been terrifying to face.
The psychological terror they inflicted, darting in and out of the combat zone with such violent speed and precision, caused disruptions entirely disproportionate to their actual numbers.
So when we pull all these pieces together, the high-risk startup financing, the crushing personal debt, the incredibly diverse ranks, including African conquistadors like Juan Garrido, the adoption of cotton armor, the indigenous forged copper pikes, the targeted sniper tactics, and the hornet-like genetic cavalry, the picture that emerges is worlds away from that gleaming silver knight marching through the jungle.
Worlds away.
It becomes blindingly clear that the Spanish success wasn't simply this overriding, inevitable wave of superior European technology just washing over the continent.
Far from it. When you analyze the raw historical material, what you see is a private, multinational, heavily indebted startup army that only survived through a profound, desperate, and highly pragmatic hybridization.
Hybridization is the perfect word for it.
It really is. It was a complex fusion of European battlefield discipline, the vital intelligence, metallurgy, and manpower of their indigenous allies, and a ruthless willingness to adapt their own martial arts to local materials and conditions. They didn't survive by being purely European. They survived by rapidly adapting to the realities of the Americas.
Which is an incredibly powerful way to reframe the entire era. We stop seeing them as robotic imperial stormtroopers and start seeing them as desperate men improvising at the edge of the world.
And this raises a deeply profound question, one that the historical sources practically demand we ask ourselves.
Okay.
Well, if the military aspect of the conquest, which we have always been taught to picture as a brutal, one-sided imposition of European will, was actually a complex, adaptive, two-way fusion of tactics and technology, what does that mean for everything else? If their very survival on the battlefield required deep hybridization with indigenous ways of war, could the political, religious, and social aspects of this historical encounter be much more hybridized and deeply complex than we've ever assumed?
That is exactly the kind of question that forces you to look at history with fresh eyes. It's not just a simplistic story of one side steamrolling another. It's a story of chaotic, messy, desperate adaptation on all sides, where the lines between conqueror and conquered blur in the mud of the battlefield. Thank you for taking this deep dive into the engine room with us today. It completely shatters the Hollywood myth and leaves us with a reality that is so much more compelling, grounded, and, well, human. And to all of you listening, keep questioning the myths, keep digging into the primary sources, and most importantly, descubre lo que no te contaron del encuentro de los mundos.